Hello, welcome to Sourdough Time. This is part 2 of the 2-part videos. This is making the bread, a simple boule. Part 1 was creating and caring for your starter. So at this point, you should have a starter that's ready to create a loaf of bread. Now the recipe I'm going to show you today comes from Victoria Redhead Miller's recipe. Mostly from that. I've learned a lot of other things from other sourdough books we have at the library. But the basic recipe follows hers pretty much exactly. So those steps, well, first I should say that Victoria Redhead Miller, the recipe I got, came from the Fermentation magazine, which has ceased publication since the pandemic. But the parent magazine, which still has recipes, is Mother Earth News, which the Carnegie-Stout subscribes to. But Victoria Redhead Miller also has a book called From No Knead to Sourdough, which is worth checking out. It would probably have a similar recipe to this. So there's basically 5 steps to this: refreshing, mixing, kneading, fermenting, and then shaping, proofing, and baking is all one step. So typically I start this the morning before I want to bake. So if I do it on Friday morning, I'll be baking Saturday morning. Steps 1, refreshing, takes place Friday morning. Then mixing and kneading takes place Friday night. It ferments overnight. And then Saturday morning is when I am shaping it and proofing it and baking it. So each of these steps is pretty straightforward, but sourdough is a slow rising yeast, so it takes a lot of time to wait. So between each of these steps, there's waiting. Fortunately, there are long enough periods where you can do it in the morning and then come back at night, and then it will do its thing, like fermenting at night. Okay, so let's get started with the first step.
Okay, so your very first step is to refresh the starter. You'll be refreshing 2 starters this time though. You'll be refreshing the starter that you keep, and then you'll be taking some out to refresh for your bread that you're going to make. That's what this bowl is for. You can use other containers too. There's some ways to anything that you can kind of see how it doubled in size. And I'll explain that more in a moment. Right now I'm putting it on my kitchen scale, and I tared it to 0. And then I'm gonna mix up the starter and then add just a couple spoonfuls. It doesn't really need much. Just as you only save a little bit when you refresh your main starter, you'll be doing the same thing here. And then later I'll be taking some out of my other starter to discard as well, so I'd refresh that about the same as normal. And now I have a tablespoon here where I'm adding my flour mixture. And you can count how many I add just so you can see about how much is 200 grams. That's what I use for this recipe, 200 grams of starter. So it doesn't have to be exact. You can use it. You can get 200 grams by about these same measurements, which I'm a little under with 5, so I found out 6 is about the good spot. So I add another tablespoon of flour and another tablespoon of water to get to, it's just over 200, but that's okay. So about 6 tablespoons of flour, 6 tablespoons of water will get you to where you need if you don't have a kitchen scale. And then I take out my chopstick and I mix it up real well until all the flour is wet and moistened, same as when I refresh my regular starter. Clean the sides a little bit with the spatula. Now, so you can see when it doubles in size. I use this bowl. I can kind of tell if it's kind of filled up to this first line. I can tell when it doubles by what groove it goes to, what other line. You could also use like a clear jar and mark your starting spot with a rubber band, which you can kind of see in the background here. Here it is closer. And then you can this is another one I just fed, and then you can see exactly when it doubles in size. And then I'm going to cover that up with a towel and set it aside. And I'll be checking on it periodically to see when it doubles in size. And don't forget to refresh your starter. So then you take out the rest, or you take out quite a bit more and leave some, and do the same thing that you usually do to refresh this starter. And then set that back in the refrigerator for making bread next week, or whenever your starter is ready.
Okay, so now my sourdough's doubled in size, or it may have already doubled and went down a little bit, but that's okay. It's still very active. You can see all those bubbles in there. So now it's time to mix the dough, which I will do separate from that. So I'll need a glass bowl, or you can use a metal bowl. You can use whatever you have. Again, I use this one because I like to see it rise. A dough rising bucket would be nice too. Now I do all this mixing by hand, and I measure it with a kitchen scale. I'll also give the measurements for cups, and so you can do it if you don't have a scale.
Okay, so I have my bowl and I have my mixer. And now I'm going to mix the flour in. So I use a total of 500 grams of flour and 350 grams of spring water. So that's 70% water for baker's percentage. And if you don't have a kitchen scale, I'll give you the measurements in cups as well. So I'll put the bowl on the scale, and I'm not going to use 500 grams of bread flour, although you could. It'll be more of a white loaf if you do that. I mix it up a little bit with some whole wheat and a little bit of rye. This is the original recipe I got from Victoria Redhead Miller, and I like it a lot. It just makes it a little more grainy and a little more healthy. But I will use mostly bread flour. So 75% of it will be bread flour, which is going to be 375 grams. So that's what I'm filling the bowl up to right now. In cups, that's 2 1/3 cups. So that's about 75% of the flour is going to be bread flour. So most of it, to get a mostly white loaf of bread. But we're going to mix in some whole wheat too. All right, we got the 375 grams of bread flour, which was the about 2 1/3 cups. And now I'll add my wheat flour, my whole wheat. With the whole wheat, I'm going to put in 100 grams. So it's going to fill my scale to 475. Okay, and for the final 25 grams, I'm going to go in with rye flour. Now, I don't always use rye flour. Sometimes I use oat or rice flour or cornmeal. Just the last 25%, add some more texture and flavor to it. And that was 3/4 a cup of whole wheat flour if you are using cups. And the rye flour, or the last flour you use, is just 3 tablespoons, which is 5% of the total amount of flour. So then I'm going to go in with my spring water. I'm going to add 350 grams of water. So I'm filling it until my scale says 850, which of water, that's about 1.5 cups. And I got all these conversions from the Victoria Redhead Miller recipe. I'm following her measurements pretty much for this recipe. Okay, and then I mix it all together by hand. If you have an electric mixer, you can mix it in that too. Just follow your instructions for that, however you mix. Just mixing it all together until all the flour is moistened and you have a dough consistency. It's going to be somewhat of a wet dough. And I have a scraper with me, a bread scraper. That helps just keep my hands a little more clean, because you'll find it will be sticking to your hands a lot, especially once you add the starter. It gets very sticky. And then to finish up, I'm going to do it on my clean counter. Just mix it up a little bit more, just because there's still some clumps in there that are dry. So I'm just rolling it together and mixing it up. Now that all my flour is wet, I'm going to leave that sit for about 20 minutes. It's good to let the gluten develop. And then when I come back in the 20 minutes, I'll mix in my starter and a little salt. Okay, now the dough has rested for 20 minutes, and you can see it's already got more structure. It's holding together much more. Those glutens have developed, the proteins have fused and developed this more tight structure, which is going to change in a moment once I add the starter, which I'm doing now. I flattened it out and added it. That's just a way I like to mix it together. Makes it just a little less messy to start out with. But it will get messy because this is going to be a wet dough. So that's my 200 grams of starter. And then I'm going to add some sea salt, which is about 10 grams, or I just use 1.5 teaspoons here. And I use the fine grain salt. It mixes up a little easier. If it's real coarse, it doesn't mix in quite as easy. Then I mix that starter in and start kneading the bread. So it's 15 minutes total of kneading, but I do it 3 times. So 15 divided by 3 is 5. So I do 3 sets of 5 minutes with rest time between each. Because as you noticed how that gluten started developing, which it does, you're fusing it together, you're fusing those proteins together when you're kneading and mixing it together. But then it needs that resting time. That resting time is when it really starts to develop. So mixing 10 minutes of resting between each kneading really helps your dough gain some structure. Now I don't really have a specific method of kneading. I use the heel of my hand to push into it and just push all the air out and then bring it back together and turn it. And kind of slap it on the counter once in a while. Now I'm sure some kneading methods might work better. Maybe they do, maybe they don't, but this one works for me. And some people don't even knead it, they do a series of stretch and folds. But this is a pretty simple knead you can do. I use it mostly with my right hand. I use my left if my right gets tired. Okay, 10 minutes have passed. I've come back for my second knead. And you can see starting to get more structure now. All that flour is sticking together and holding together more. So now I'm going to go ahead and knead this for 5 minutes. And then 10 minutes later, I come back for my final knead. And at this point, it's very doughy. I'm sticking a little less. Still sticking a little. It's still a sticky dough to work with, but not nearly as much as when I started. And you really want to push into the dough when you are kneading to get all the air pockets out and to fuse the proteins together. So when you're working it for 5 minutes, go ahead and put some muscle into it, but still give it those rest periods. And then after that final knead, you will roll it up into a ball, either with your scraper or your hands, and then put it into a bowl, your same mixing bowl or a dough rising bucket or metal bowl or whatever you have. And this is where it does the long ferment, which I leave to ferment overnight. So it ferments usually between 10 and 12 hours, so it's perfect to check in the morning and then do then. So what I like to do, since I have a clear bowl, is put some masking tape on it so I can see exactly when it doubles in size. So I put one on the bottom to where the dough currently is, and then I go for the bottom of that second piece of tape. That's just my method. And then I know when it reaches there that it's doubled in size. If you have a dough rising bucket, it has the measurements on the side. Otherwise, if your container isn't clear, I've seen people cut a tiny piece off and put it in a clear jar and mark that. Then when that doubles, they know that the rest of the dough has doubled.
So as you can see, my dough has doubled in size. And now it's ready to get out of the bowl and proof. So that's what we'll do now.
Okay, now it's time to take it out of the bowl. So you can see I'm pulling at the sides carefully, and it's holding its form very nicely. That's what you want. I had one that over fermented before, and I'll show you the difference, and I'll talk about that in a moment here. But I'm pulling it onto a floured surface. Sometimes I use flour on the surface, and sometimes I don't. Sometimes I have the consistency varies a little bit with the dough, and this is still a little on the wet side, so I just think the floured surface will help things stick a little bit less. So now I'm forming the boule. You can see I'm using the scraper. You can also do this with your hands. So I'm using the scraper in a hand, and then I go underneath and turn it. And I just keep doing this to get a nice ball shape, because boule is French for ball, and I'm just getting it nice and round. And now I'm doing it with my hands to show you how you can do it that way too. And I also turn it over sometimes a little bit just to have less of a seam. It's okay to have a seam on the bottom. That's going to be the bottom of the bread anyway, but you want to get it as round as possible. And I almost forgot, I'm using a banneton to proof it in. You could also just do this in a bowl, a big bowl. That's what I did for the longest time before I got one of these. These are nice though. They give it nice form. Sometimes I use this liner, sometimes I don't. It stuck last time when I over fermented the bread though, so I'm doing it with the liner this time. I use half tough flour, gluten-free flour from North Africa, and so half of that and then half all-purpose flour in this blend, because you want a gluten-free flour so it doesn't stick. So rice flour would work as well, or anything gluten-free. And now I need to cover it, which I haven't used this liner much. I was just trying to cover it with the sides. That didn't quite work. So I'm just going to go over it with a towel. And then I'm going to set it aside and let it check on it again in about an hour. That's about how long it usually takes to proof. Sometimes it takes up to 2 hours though. Okay, 1 hour passed, and we're going to do the poke test. So what you want to do for the poke test is literally just poke it. But you put your finger in till about the first digit of your knuckle. If it springs back very quickly, like it did here, then it hasn't quite proofed long enough yet. The gas bubbles are still forming in there, and you might not get the rise that you want. You want that sweet spot between underproofing and overproofing. If the dent stays, then it's overproofed, and you risk it collapsing, that they've produced as much bubbles as they can, and then the dough might collapse on you when you bake it. So I'm in a check on this again in about half an hour, 30 minutes.
Okay, now it's set for about an hour and a half, and you can still see a couple indents. I just did it before the video was shooting. So poke test, go in, give it a good poke, and it springs back quick, but then it still leaves an indent in there. So this should be ready to go. You can see again. So this is ready to go. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tip it over and put it on the parchment paper, and then I'm going to score it with this. This is like a razor blade. It came with the Banneton. If you just have a regular razor blade, a clean one, that would work too. Or a very sharp knife. Has to be very sharp though, so it doesn't drag in the dough. That's what I used before I got this, and I was able to get it through eventually, but a nice sharp blade works very well. So after I put it on here, then I back up, I put the parchment right into the Dutch oven and put that back into the oven. So let's take this out. There we go. Okay, then I will score it quickly. Just do, it's like a box shape. You can just do straight lines too. Okay, now I'm going to back up and go directly into the oven.
So I had this Dutch oven preheating in my oven for 45 minutes at 475 degrees. I did this all while I was proofing. If you don't have a Dutch oven, you can still preheat your oven to 475 degrees for as long as that takes, maybe 15 minutes to half an hour. And you can just use a baking sheet, put it on there. But I highly recommend a Dutch oven if you have one. This is one thing that did bring my bread baking to the next level. It traps in the steam and helps the rise a lot. I've done good loaves on a baking sheet, but I get better rise in this Dutch oven. And then I set the timer for 30 minutes, and I'm going to take the lid off after 30 minutes and then let it bake the rest of the way without the lid for about another 10 to 12 minutes in my oven. It might be longer in yours. This is gas. So it might be a little different on your oven.
Okay, the timer is going off. So it's time to take the lid off and see what kind of rise we got out of our bread. Very nice. Just show it for a minute and I'll put it back in. For about 12 minutes. Okay, and now 12 more minutes have gone by, and we're going to take this out and get a good look at it. I think it turned out very well. Okay, now we'll take it out of the pan. And I'll zoom in so we can get a good look before I take the parchment paper off. very hot. Peel that right off. And you can see this is what we like to see, these nice crusty marks like that coming off of it. Nice and hollow in the middle and crispy on the outside. And then it's tempting to cut into it right away, but you're going to want to let that sit a couple hours before you cut into it, so you don't lose any of your shape. Okay, now let's cut into this and see what the inside looks like. I've got my bread knife here. And I have to leave this overnight because I finished the bread at night. I would have liked to cut into it when it was still warm. That's okay. It was 11 o'clock when I finished it because of the way I timed things, and I didn't want to wait 2 hours to cut into it and be up past midnight to cut into the bread. Okay, so let's look at the inside of this, the crumb as they call it. That's the crumb. I have a little bit tighter knit structure. I might have to do with how I kneaded it. And you can see it has a nice rise that'll make nice, beautiful toast for whatever I make it with. Sandwiches, I do it every morning with eggs pretty much. Has some nice air pockets in there. Now, I just want to compare this. I had one that didn't turn out in the process of making this video. The temperature was hotter in my house than it normally was, so my timing was off and things fermented quicker. So when I did the bulk ferment for this other loaf, I let it sit too long, and my dough didn't have any structure when I was putting it together. And that one turned out like this. It's basically flat, doesn't have any structure, doesn't have those nice colors on top. It's just one kind of solid dark color. Doesn't look too bad on the inside. It'll probably still taste good. And that kind of stuff happens all the time when you're doing this. It's really, like I said, an experimentation. You're gonna find some things work better and some things don't. But pretty much every loaf of bread I've made has been good. Some better than others. There's only been a couple that I was like, I'm probably not gonna finish this. But it's all a learning process. And as you get the hang of this more and get the feel for how long things should wait and adjust things accordingly, you'll learn how to make a loaf that suits you. So I hope you learned a lot from this video. I hope you go out and try and make some bread yourself. Have a lot of fun with it. And yeah, happy baking. Bye.